The crimson sun rose over the Pacific on June 3, 1942, painting the vast ocean in shades of blood and gold. Admiral Kiichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the most formidable naval armada Japan had ever assembled. For mighty carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Sorya cut through the swells like steel leviathans, their flight decks bristling with the Empire's finest aircraft. The morning breeze carried with it the acrid smell of aviation fuel and the metallic tang of preparation. Below deck, mechanics made final adjustments to Zero fighters and Valdive bombers, their tools clanking rhythmically against the carrier's hull. Pilots gathered in ready rooms, their faces masks of confidence built upon 6 months of unbroken victory across the Pacific. "The Americans cannot possibly know we are coming," Vice Admiral Nagumo muttered to his chief of staff, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka. The intelligence reports had been clear. The United States Pacific Fleet remained crippled after Pearl Harbor, scattered and demoralized. Midway Atoll, that tiny speck of coral and sand 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, would fall within hours of their assault. What Nagumo could not know was that 3,000 miles away, cryptanalysts in a basement in Pearl Harbor had already unraveled the secrets of the Japanese naval code. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had worked tirelessly through sleepless nights, deciphering enemy transmissions that revealed not just the target, but the exact timing and composition of the Japanese strike force. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's seminal work, The Toe-Ocean War, the American codebreakers had achieved what many considered impossible: complete penetration of Japanese operational communications. The Kido Butai, Japan's first air fleet, represented the cream of the Imperial Navy. These 4 carriers had launched the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, devastated Darwin, and swept British naval power from the Indian Ocean. Their pilots were veterans, battle-tested and supremely confident. The Zero fighters had proven themselves superior to any Allied aircraft they had encountered, while the Kate torpedo bombers and Valdive bombers had sent dozens of enemy warships to the bottom of the Pacific. As the sun climbed higher, Mitsuo Fukita, hero of Pearl Harbor, conducted his final briefing with the strike force commanders. Maps of Midway covered the ready room walls, showing the tiny atoll's defensive positions, its airstrip, and its handful of buildings. It looked pathetically small, hardly worth the attention of Japan's mightiest fleet. "Gentlemen," Fukita announced, "to the assembled aviators, tomorrow we complete what we began at Pearl Harbor. The American Pacific Fleet will be forced to come out and fight, and when they do, we will destroy them utterly." "Aye!" The pilots nodded, their confidence absolute. They had good reason for such assurance. Since December 7, 1941, Japanese naval aviation had dominated every engagement, sinking battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers with impunity. The rising sun painted on their wings had become a symbol of invincibility across the Pacific theater. But 1,500 miles to the northeast, on a small coral atoll, barely 6 miles long, American Marines and Navy personnel prepared for the storm they knew was coming. Unlike their Japanese counterparts, they harbored no illusions about the odds they faced. Dawn broke over Midway Atoll on June 4, 1942, with an ominous stillness that seemed to press down upon the tiny garrison like a physical weight. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding the Marine Air Forces on Eastern Island, stood beside the runway, watching his pilots conduct final pre-flight checks on their obsolete aircraft. Brewster Buffalo fighters and Douglas Dauntless dive bombers are craft that had already proven themselves inferior to their Japanese counterparts. Represented the atoll's primary air defense. At 0 for 30 hours, a Catalina flying boat, piloted by Ensign Jack Reed, spotted the approaching Japanese fleet. His radio crackled across the static-filled frequency. Enemy carriers bearing 3 to 0 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25 knots. Within minutes, every available aircraft was racing down the runways, climbing desperately into the pre-dawn darkness. Marine Fighter Squadron 2-1, led by Major Floyd Parks, took to the air in their outclassed Buffaloes, knowing they faced an almost impossible task against the legendary Zero fighters. Admiral Nagumo, aboard the Akagi, received the first reports of American air activity with mild concern but no real alarm. His combat air patrol of Zeros would easily handle whatever obsolete aircraft the Americans could muster. At 0430, he gave the order for the first wave to launch 108 aircraft thundering from the decks of his 4 carriers. Bound for Midway's destruction, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the strike force in his Kate bomber. The rising sun clearly visible through his cockpit canopy. Below, the Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, a blue desert broken only by the white wakes of the Japanese fleet. The formation flew in perfect order, Zeros providing top cover while Kates and Vals prepared to unleash destruction upon the American base. What neither Tomonaga nor Nagumo realized was that Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned his own trap with meticulous precision. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, lurked 200 miles northeast of Midway with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher aboard the Yorktown, waited nearby. Hidden by a convenient weather front, the American carriers had reached their positions. Through a combination of superior intelligence and careful positioning, Fletcher, as senior officer present, commanded both task forces with the knowledge that surprise represented their only advantage against the veteran Japanese aviators. His pilots were brave but inexperienced, their aircraft inferior in many respects to Japanese equipment. At 0555, the first Japanese bombs began falling on Midway. Sand and coral exploded skyward as Vals screamed down in their characteristic steep dives, while Kate swept in low to torpedo the seaplane hangars. Marine gunners on the ground fired back with desperate courage, their anti-aircraft shells bursting among the attacking formations. Major Parks led his Buffalo fighters into the Japanese formation with suicidal bravery. The obsolete American fighters stood no chance against the nimble Zeros, but the Marines pressed their attacks anyway. Within minutes, 15 of the 25 Buffaloes had been shot down, their pilots dead or wounded. Parks himself went down with his aircraft, another casualty of American unpreparedness meeting Japanese expertise. Yet even as Midway burned under the Japanese assault, the trap was closing. At 0600 hours, Admiral Fletcher gave the order his subordinates had been waiting for: launch the attack. From the decks of 3 American carriers, every available aircraft began taking to the air dauntless dive bombers Devastator, torpedo planes, Wildcat fighters racing toward their rendezvous with destiny. The stage was set for the most decisive naval engagement in Pacific history. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay gripped the controls of his Douglas Devastator torpedo bomber as Torpedo Squadron 6 lifted off from the Enterprise at 0700 hours on June 4th. Behind him, 14 more TBDs struggled into formation. Their obsolete aircraft heavily laden with Mark 13 torpedoes that had proven notoriously unreliable in previous engagements. The morning sun cast long shadows across the carriers. Flight deck as the last of the squadron cleared the ship. 300 miles to the southwest, Admiral Nagumo faced his first crucial decision of the battle. Lieutenant Tomonaga's strike force had successfully attacked Midway, but the pilots' radio message troubled the Japanese commander. Second attack necessary to neutralize remaining defenses. The American base had not been completely destroyed, and Tomonaga's aircraft bore visible damage from unexpectedly fierce anti-aircraft fire. On the hangar decks of the 4 Japanese carriers, ordnance crews worked frantically to rearm the second wave of aircraft, armor-piercing bombs intended for use against American warships were removed and replaced with fragmentation bombs more suitable for ground targets. The process was time-consuming and left the carriers vulnerable. Their decks cluttered with ordnance and fuel lines. At 0755 hours, the radar operator aboard the Akagi reported multiple aircraft contacts approaching from the northeast. The blips on his screen represented American carrier aircraft, but Nagumo still believed the United States Pacific Fleet remained in Pearl Harbor. These must be land-based bombers from Midway or perhaps Hawaii. The first American attack came from Major Lofton Henderson's Marine Scout Bombing Squadron. 2 for 1. flying obsolete Dauntless dive bombers and Vindicator light bombers. The Marines pressed their attack with desperate courage against the Japanese fleet. Henderson himself led the assault, his aircraft diving through intense anti-aircraft fire toward the carrier Hiryu. Fighters from the Combat Air Patrol fell upon the slow American bombers like wolves among sheep. Henderson's Dauntless took multiple hits, trailing smoke and fire as it continued its dive. The Marine Major held his aircraft steady until the last possible moment before releasing his bomb, scoring a near miss that showered the Hiryu's flight deck with fragments. Henderson's bomber crashed into the sea moments later, its pilot dead at the controls. The carnage continued as Japanese Zeros systematically destroyed the attacking American formations. Marine Captain Richard Fleming led his Vindicators against the battleship Haruna, his antiquated bomber, somehow surviving the gauntlet of enemy fire to score another near miss. But the cost was horrific. More than half the American aircraft were shot down without inflicting significant damage on the Japanese fleet. Nagumo watched the slaughter with grim satisfaction. But his attention was soon drawn to more pressing concerns. The first wave of Japanese aircraft was returning from Midway, many damaged and low on fuel. The carriers would need to recover these aircraft quickly, but the flight decks remained cluttered with the second wave, still being rearmed for the anticipated second strike on Midway at 0830 hours. A lookout aboard the cruiser Tone reported the sighting that would change everything. Enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles, course 150, speed over 20 knots. For the first time, Nagumo realized that American carriers were operating in the area. The Japanese admiral faced an agonizing decision. Should he launch the second wave immediately against Midway, or rearm again with armor-piercing bombs and anti-ship torpedoes for an attack on the newly discovered American fleet? His staff urged caution. The returning aircraft from the first wave needed to be recovered before any new launch could begin. As Nagumo wrestled with his decision, Lieutenant Commander Lindsay's torpedo squadron was already beginning its attack run on the Japanese carriers. The obsolete Devastators flew low over the water, their pilots knowing they faced almost certain death but pressing forward anyway. The trap that Admiral Nimitz had so carefully laid was about to spring shut with devastating effect. The Pacific. Wind whistled through the open cockpit of Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's TBD Devastator as torpedo squadron. 8 from the Hornet approached the Japanese fleet at 0920 hours. Behind him, 14 more obsolete torpedo bombers maintained formation despite the growing wall of anti-aircraft fire rising from the enemy ships below. Waldron had trained his pilots hard, knowing their aircraft were inferior and their torpedoes unreliable, but hoping courage might compensate for technological disadvantage. Attack immediately. Waldron radioed to his squadron as the Japanese carriers came into view. The 4 flat tops steamed in a rough diamond formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft in various stages of preparation. Zeros from the combat. Air Patrol dove toward the approaching Americans like angry hornets, their machine guns and cannons already chattering. The slaughter began immediately. Ensign George Gay, flying wing position on Waldron, watched in horror as Zero fighters systematically destroyed his squadron mates. The Japanese pilots were veterans, their aircraft superior in every respect to the lumbering American torpedo bombers. One by one, the Devastators fell from the sky. Trailing smoke and flame as they crashed into the Pacific, Waldron's own aircraft took multiple hits as he pressed his attack on the carrier Soryu. His gunner, aviation radio man First Class Horace Dobbs, fired back desperately at the swarming Zeros. But their .30 caliber machine gun was no match for Japanese 20mm cannons. The TBD shuddered under the impact of enemy shells, its fabric-covered control surfaces shredding in the wind. "Your attack," Waldron ordered over the radio, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. His torpedo bomber continued straight toward the Soryu, maintaining course even as Japanese shells tore through the cockpit. At the last moment, Waldron released his torpedo and pulled up, but Zero fighters finished his crippled aircraft moments. Later, the squadron commander died at his controls, his Devastator crashing into the sea just short of the Japanese formation. Ensign Gay's aircraft was the last of torpedo, still flying. His TBD had taken multiple hits, the engine smoking and the hydraulics failing. But he pressed his attack on the carrier Kaga, at minimum range. He released his torpedo and watched it run straight and true toward the enemy carrier, only to see it explode harmlessly against the ship's armored belt. Japanese anti-aircraft fire finished his crippled bomber moments later, sending it plunging into the Pacific. Gay managed to inflate his life raft and hide under a seat cushion as the Japanese fleet steamed past. He would be the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, witness to one of the most gallant and futile attacks in naval aviation history. All 15 aircraft of his squadron had been destroyed without scoring a single hit. Similar carnage befell the other torpedo squadrons. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo 6 from the Enterprise lost 10 of 14 aircraft. A Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown was virtually annihilated. The Devastator torpedo bombers, already obsolete when the war began, proved completely outclassed by Japanese fighters in anti-aircraft fire. Admiral Nagumo watched the destruction of the American torpedo attack with satisfaction. But the low-level assaults had accomplished something crucial. They had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level and scattered the Zero fighters across the ocean. The Japanese carriers' flight decks remained cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance as the crews struggled to recover the returning strike force from Midway, while simultaneously preparing for a new attack on the American fleet at 950 hours, as the last American torpedo bomber fell flaming into the sea. Lookouts aboard the Japanese carrier scanned the sky for additional threats. The torpedo attacks had been costly failures, confirming Japanese superiority in aircraft and pilot training, but high above the scattered formations of enemy fighters, unseen and undetected, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise toward their target. The most decisive moment in the Pacific War was less than 10 minutes away. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey squinted through his goggles at the empty ocean below, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels as he led Bombing Squadron 6 and Scouting Squadron 6 in search of the Japanese fleet. It was 0955 hours on June 4th, and the Enterprise Air Group had been flying for over 2 hours without finding their target. Behind him, 36 other dauntless dive bombers maintained formation, their pilots growing. Increasingly concerned about fuel consumption, McClu Sky had made a crucial decision 30 minutes earlier when he failed to locate the enemy at the reported position. Instead of turning back, he had continued southwest, gambling that the Japanese fleet had changed course. Now, as his fuel reserves dwindled, he spotted something that would change the course of the Pacific War: a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed, leaving a distinctive white wake on the blue ocean. The destroyer was the Arashi, which had been depth-charging the submarine USS Nautilus. Captain Watanabe was now racing to rejoin the main fleet, unknowingly leading the American dive bombers directly to their target. McCluskey followed the wake like a highway in the sky, and at 1000 hours, the Japanese carriers appeared on the horizon. Below, Admiral Nagumo's fleet steamed in formation, the 4 carriers' flight decks crowded. With aircraft in various stages of preparation, the morning's torpedo attacks had ended in complete American failure, and the Japanese crews were working frantically to launch a decisive strike against the newly discovered American carriers. Lines snaked across the decks while ordnance crews loaded armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes. The Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level by the torpedo attacks and was now scattered across miles of ocean, low on fuel and ammunition. Most of the Zero pilots were landing to refuel and rearm, leaving the carriers temporarily vulnerable to high-altitude attack. McCluskey divided his force, leading Bombing 6 against the carrier Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best took scouting. 6, after the flagship Akagi, the dauntless dive bombers climbed to 14,000 feet, positioning themselves for the near-vertical attacks that made them so deadly. Japanese lookouts finally spotted the American aircraft. It was too late for effective defensive measures. At 1022 hours, McCluskey pushed over into his dive, followed by 17 other dauntlesses targeting the Kaga. The carrier was caught in the worst possible position, her flight deck packed with fueled and armed aircraft. Unable to maneuver effectively due to the recovery operations in progress, McCluskey's 1,000-pound bomb struck near the island's superstructure, its explosion igniting aviation fuel that spread fire across the crowded deck. The third carrier to suffer during these crucial 5 minutes was the Hiryu, attacked by 17 Dauntlesses from the Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie. Despite mechanical problems that had forced Leslie to jettison his bomb early, his squadron pressed home their attack with devastating accuracy. 3 direct hits transformed the Hiryu into another blazing wreck, her crew abandoning ship within 20 minutes of the first bomb impact. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks. The Kido Butai, Japan's elite First Air Fleet, had been gutted by precise American dive bombing. Hundreds of experienced Japanese pilots died in the flames, along with irreplaceable aircraft and ship's crews that had taken years to train. Admiral Nagumo, his flagship Akagi, burning around him, transferred his command to the cruiser Nagara as damage control parties fought desperately to save the carrier. The morning that had begun with such promise for the Japanese fleet had turned into an unmitigated disaster in the space of a few minutes. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, the sole surviving flat top of Admiral Nagumo's once mighty Kido Butai, as black smoke billowed from his 3 sister ships on the horizon. The time was 1100 hours on June 4th, 1942, and the Pacific War had been transformed in a single morning. The Akagi, Kaga, and Hiryu burned like funeral pyres on the calm ocean, their crews fighting desperately against fires that threatened to detonate their magazines. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from the Hiryu, paced the bridge with grim determination. Unlike Admiral Nagumo, who had transferred to a cruiser when the Akagi became uninhabitable, Yamaguchi remained aboard his carrier, determined to extract some measure of revenge from the Americans. The Hiryu still possessed 40 operational aircraft-hating dive bombers and 6 fighters that had been spotted for launch when the American attack struck the other carriers. Prepare for immediate launch, Yamaguchi ordered his air operations officer. Target the American carriers. Intelligence reports indicated at least 2 enemy flat tops operating northeast of Midway, and Yamaguchi intended to strike them before they could launch another attack. His pilots were among Japan's finest. Veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids who had never known defeat, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the first strike from the Hiryu Val dive bombers, escorted by 6 fighters. The formation climbed steadily as it departed the burning Japanese fleet, heading northeast toward the reported position of the American carriers. Below them, rescue destroyers circled the stricken Japanese carriers, pulling survivors from the oil-slicked water. At 1210 hours, Kobayashi's formation spotted Task Force 17. The carrier Yorktown steamed in the center of a protective screen of cruisers and destroyers, her flight deck busy recovering the dive bombers that had just devastated the Japanese fleet. Combat Air Patrol Wildcats orbited overhead, but they were too few to stop a determined attack by experienced Japanese pilots. The Vals pushed over into their attack dives from 10,000 feet, ignoring the bursting anti-aircraft shells that filled the sky around them. Kobayashi's bomb struck the Yorktown amidships, penetrating deep into the carrier before exploding near the forward engine room. 2 more hits followed in quick succession, one near the island superstructure and another on the flight deck, setting fires and knocking out power throughout the ship. The Yorktown took on a severe list and lost way, her crew fighting damage. Control battles similar to those raging aboard the Japanese carriers. But American damage control techniques, developed through hard experience, proved superior to their Japanese counterparts. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown's skilled repair parties had the fires under control and the ship capable of flight operations. Admiral Yamaguchi, learning of the attack's success through radio reports, immediately prepared a second strike. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros launched from the Hiryu at 1330 hours, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had commanded the morning attack on Midway. Tominaga's aircraft had taken damage during that earlier mission, but he flew anyway, knowing the importance of pressing home the attack on the American carriers. The second Japanese strike found the Yorktown apparently undamaged, her repair parties having worked miracles in restoring the ship to operational status. American fighters intercepted the incoming Japanese aircraft, but several Kates broke through the defensive screen. Tomonaga's torpedo struck the Yorktown's port side, flooding the forward engine room and causing the carrier to list heavily to port. This time the damage proved beyond immediate repair. Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship at 1500 hours, and the Yorktown's crew began the difficult process of evacuating their vessel. The carrier that had survived Pearl Harbor and participated in the Coral Sea battle was finally succumbing to Japanese torpedoes and bombs, but Admiral Yamaguchi's moment of triumph was short-lived. Even as the Yorktown settled lower in the water, radar operators aboard the Enterprise and Hornet were plotting the return course of the Japanese strike aircraft. At 1645 hours, 24 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, spotted the Hiryu steaming alone on the darkening Pacific. The attack that followed sealed the fate of the Japanese carrier force, for direct hits in rapid succession transformed the Hiryu into the same kind of blazing wreck that her sister ships had become hours earlier. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, standing at attention on the bridge as fires consumed the last of Japan's Pearl Harbor strike force. The sun hung low over the Pacific on the evening of June 4th, 1942, casting long shadows across a seascape littered with the debris of broken dreams and shattered fleets. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, stood on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, 300 miles northwest of the carnage, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had buffeted in his forces. For aircraft carriers, the heart of Japan's naval aviation burned, or had already slipped beneath the waves. The Akagi, his former flagship, had finally succumbed to the fires at 1920 hours, taking with her the memories of Pearl Harbor and a dozen other victories. The Kaga had followed her to the bottom at 1925, while the Soryu had disappeared beneath the Pacific at 1913. Only the Hiryu remained afloat. But reports from Admiral Yamaguchi made clear that she, too, was doomed. Signal all units to withdraw, Yamamoto ordered his chief of staff, Captain Kurashima. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but the reality was inescapable. Japan had gambled everything on this operation. The capture of Midway Atoll and the destruction of the American Pacific Fleet. Instead, they had suffered the most devastating naval defeat in Japanese history. 3,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the preliminary battle reports with a mixture of elation and disbelief. His desperate gamble had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. The Japanese carrier force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months lay in ruins. And American naval aviation had proven itself capable of defeating the supposedly invincible enemy. The human cost of victory was staggering on both sides. Japan had lost over 3,000 men, including hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots whose training had taken years to complete. The United States had suffered 307 killed, including the gallant aviators of the torpedo. Squadrons who had died to create the opportunity for the dive bomber's success. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was rescued by a Catalina flying boat on June 5th after spending 30 hours floating in his life raft among the debris of the Japanese fleet. His testimony would provide valuable intelligence about Japanese damage control procedures and confirm the destruction of 3 enemy carriers. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Capacity could replace the lost carriers, but the trained aircrew would take years to reconstitute. The offensive capability that had terrorized the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon has been permanently crippled in a single day of combat. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had warned that Japan could run wild for only 6 months after attacking America, saw his prediction fulfilled with devastating accuracy. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned irreversibly, though few realized it at the time. The Japanese Empire would fight on for 3 more years, but never again would its carrier forces threaten American territory or dictate the terms of engagement. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4th, rescue vessels from both fleets searched the oil-slicked waters for survivors. The destroyer USS Hughes pulled Lieutenant Commander McCluskey from the sea after his Dauntless ran out of fuel on the return flight to the Enterprise. Japanese destroyers rescued Admiral Nagumo and other staff officers from the burning Akagi, but left behind hundreds of sailors and pilots whose bodies would never be recovered. The Battle of Midway was over, but its consequences would reverberate throughout the remainder of World War II. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt received news of the victory with quiet satisfaction. Knowing that American industrial might would now have time to reach full production. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito learned of the disaster with imperial silence, but the foundations of Japanese confidence had been shaken irrevocably. The mighty carrier group that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect lay scattered across the Pacific floor, victims of American code-breaking, tactical brilliance, and the extraordinary courage of aviators who pressed home their attacks against impossible odds. The age of Japanese naval supremacy had ended in 5 minutes of precise dive bombing. The long road to Tokyo Bay had begun. Japan's mighty carrier group was gutted by Midway's surprise devastation, and with it died the rising sun's dreams of Pacific dominance.